Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 60th edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. And Jacob, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming in.
Afternoon it is. So I'm going to start by picking up on a theme we explored before, though not very deeply for reasons that will become obvious. So my opening question is football coming home?
Well, let's hope so. And let's hope it's coming home to one of the three UK constituent parts that is involved. And I have more of a vested interest in this than you might expect. I mean, the Rees bit of me is quite Welsh. I've always, however, lived in England. But crucially, in the Chairman of Ways and Means corridor sweepstake, I've drawn Scotland. So I have a great interest in the outcome.
So you will be busy this afternoon. I should say as ever to the listeners that this afternoon is Monday when we're recording the Moggcast, whereas you're all listening on Tuesday. And Jacob, you're a bit more up to date with the football news than you were when I last raised this and you drew attention to your love of cricket. So since we're on football, let me ask you all about taking the knee. When teams take the knee, what do you think they're doing?
I think it's become problematic because the symbol of taking the knee has become associated with the BLM movement. And that is where the controversy becomes very apparent and very stark. The BLM movement is a Marxist movement that wants to do things like defund the police and is not sympathetic to our current civic structures. On the other hand, I think footballers are showing that they are opposed to racism, and this has been a long-running battle in football with things like Kick It Out that have been remarkably successful, but where there is still inevitably more to be done. So I think the difficulty is over the symbolism that has become attached to taking the knee, which is in fact an American issue that relates to people kneeling down during the national anthem, which is sung before all sorts of games in the US in the way that it just isn't in the United Kingdom. And it's one of the dangers of adopting American political habits in the UK.
That's why I wanted to ask you about what the reason is for people kneeling, because there are different reasons. I mean, it's just a quick supplementary. How many footballers do you think are really kneeling because they support Black Lives Matter?
I have absolutely no idea. I wouldn't have thought many at all. But that's the symbolism that is inherent within taking the knee and has been for the last year. How many of them are making a protest against the American national anthem? I would have thought none. I doubt many of them care about the American national anthem one way or another.
Not that anyone's playing the American national anthem in the European Championships. But let me now ask the same question in reverse. When fans boo taking a knee, what do you think they're booing?
I think they are booing the BLM movement. I think that's quite clearly a reaction to the what is now known about BLM and the underlying political message, which is one that is not sympathetic to the United Kingdom as a nation.
You don't think they're racists?
No, I don't think there's any evidence that they're racists. I think calling them racists is unfairly attributing views to people who have been part of a movement in football that has taken huge strides to reduce racism. It's very interesting. At one football game, they'd been booed for taking the knee. I think all places at Millwall, which has a reputation for not perhaps being the most inclusive side in the country. And the following week, they had a statement against racism and got cheered. And so I don't think that it is racism. I think it is...
At Millwall.
This was at Millwall. At Millwall, of all places. And so I think the objection to it is the politicisation through the BLM movement rather than a huge hinterland of racism in football, because I think football has actually done extraordinarily well over the years in reducing racism within it's sport.
Do you really think that the fans who are booing, I'm not just for a moment, for the sake of the argument, to accept your premise that most of them aren't racist, do you think they're really booing because they've heard of the Black Lives Matter various manifestos and disapprove? Or if they're booing simply because they feel in some ways the authorities are sort of blaming them for the problem of racism in society and that they feel this is unfair?
Well, it's nothing to do with UK politics, is it? That it is an American symbol that has been adopted into a UK political context. Do I think that the fans have gone through every detail of the BLM manifesto? No, I very much doubt that. But they have an understanding of what has become the political connotation of taking the knee. And I think there is a pushback more generally against wokeness and the really rather scandalous behaviour of the Oxford dons who are refusing to teach people at Oriel who, through no fault of their own, are at a college that happens to have a statue of Rhodes that it is difficult to take down and they shouldn't be taking down anyway. But that is such an attack on intellectual academic freedom, such a appalling restrictive practice. It's like the print unions in the 1970s refusing to print leaders that they didn't approve of. And it is really bad behaviour and is quite serious. I mean, they may be very second-rate, these dons who are doing it. They may be rather silly people, but what they're doing is actually really rather important.
Are there still serious problems of racism in Britain?
Well, the government commissioned a very good and important report on this, as you know, and it said that, yes, there are racist people in the United Kingdom, people who hold very unpleasant views. I will confess I have constituents who write to me expressing these views from time to time. So, of course, there is some element of racism still within this country. But what the report was also able to say was that it is not institutionalized, and that actually one of the greatest areas of discrimination is not to do with race, but to do with class. And that was and there's a very good article in the Times on exactly the subject today obviously being Monday, by Trevor Phillips.
And if there is still a problem of racism in football, I'm not going to try to draw you into that discussion because it's not your special subject, but some people say there still is. There's still some abuse on the field. There's a very small number of black managers and so on. If there is still a problem, do you think there's anything the government can do or should do to go to the football authorities, go to the clubs and encourage them to find some other method of campaigning other than taking the knee? I mean, you drew attention earlier to Kick It Out. I mean, Kick It Out's rather taken a back seat in the events of the last few months. Has the government got a responsibility to try and do something like that and steer protest towards a ground where everyone can support it, rather than it being a cause of division?
Yeah, I mean, the government's view is that action should be taken rather than purely gestures. And Kick It Out was much more of an active programme rather than a pure gesture. You've always got to be careful in the government's involvement with independent organisations. They need to make decisions for themselves, and we don't want the government controlling every aspect of our lives or every aspect of sporting endeavour. But I think encouraging anti-racist movements in a way that actually achieves something is a reasonable thing for governments to do, and perhaps even an important thing for governments to do, but more through conversations and discussions and indications of shared knowledge of what's worked in other areas, rather than saying you must do this or you mustn't do that.
Well, as you said, England have played, Wales have played, Scotland will have played by the time this broadcast goes out. But let's go to Northern Ireland and discuss the Northern Ireland Protocol in the wake of the G7. Just a bit of background on you. Have you always been a very strong unionist? I
can't remember a time when I wasn't. So I think the answer is yes. I think I've always believed that the United Kingdom is what I belong to and how I see myself, rather than as a little Englander.
Just out of curiosity, but the whole sort of panoply of the kit the Pope bans and the green grassy bank of the Boyne and the sashes and all that, the anti-popery, that never had an effect on you?
Well, you must remember that after the Battle of the Boyne, the then Pope ordered that a Te Deum should be sung in St. Peter's in celebration of the victory of William of Orange, because he was opposed to Louis XIV. And I am therefore orthodox in my view in supporting William of Orange's victory at the Battle of the Boyne, along with the then Holy Father.
I'm looking forward to you explaining that in person on the next, coming night of the 12th in, say, Tiger Bay in Belfast. But we'll pass that by for a moment and come to the protocol. Fundamental question about the protocol. Is it workable or not? Or is it so fundamentally flawed it can't work?
Oh, I think if what is in it were actually done and all parts of it were followed, then it would be workable. That it recognises that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom. It has Northern Ireland in our customs union and in our single market, and it then has provisions to try and protect the Republic of Ireland and therefore the EU single market from at-risk goods. And currently, the EU seems to think that there is a great desire to smuggle sausages into the Republic of Ireland to get them all over Germany and France and Italy and Hungary. I mean, the sort of sausage export fervour that there is likely to be if they're not stopped from getting into Northern Ireland is something that we should only marvel at. I always knew the British sausage was popular, but I didn't realise that the Germans were going to give up their 100 varieties of sausage to have a Wall's banger.
I'm simply asking because our columnist, Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan, I should now say, wrote in the Telegraph yesterday, I think, essentially that the whole protocol is hopeless and that some, constitutional abhorrence. I hope I'm not misquoting Lord Hannan, and that the whole thing should simply be abolished. That's not your position, is it? The protocol can be made to work if the EU is reasonable.
If the EU were to be reasonable. But actually, although sausages have become the main topic of conversation, I think mainly because this was the leadership campaign of Jim Hacker. That's how he got elected, was an attack on an earlier fictional attempt by Brussels to ban the British banger. Much more serious is medicines. I mean, on what possible basis does the EU not wish to allow drugs that have been proved in the UK to be used in Northern Ireland hospitals?
Okay, we've agreed that, your view is, in principle, it can work, but the EU are not allowing it to work. If the EU don't allow it to work, there are really two options, it seems to me. One is to keep rolling forward these delays in essentially exemptions. You just do it on a piece-by-piece sort of basis. The other route is you act more formally under Article 16, which you will remind me in a moment the EU has itself used, not very happily, in order effectively to suspend the working of the protocol. Now, do you think we should do A or B? And can we rule out B, i.e. suspending the protocol altogether?
Well, the EU showed that there was a relatively low bar to using Article 16, which is important, and important in the context of this. But I think we've discussed before, I think it's important to try and establish a friendly relationship with the European Union, which is inevitably bruised because we left, inevitably regrets that happening because it's about being ever-expanding European Union, not one that loses members along the wayside. So there is a sensitivity with the EU, which is an important neighbour and ally of ours. So we want to have as good a relationship as possible, and therefore what we need to do is maintain the economic integrity of the United Kingdom, the strong trade links that go east-west, and do so in a way that is as unconfrontational as possible. That seems to be a sensible approach, and it depends how the EU responds as we seek to do that. If they're reasonable, the protocol can work very smoothly. If they're not reasonable, we need to look at it in two ways. One is in the short term. We do not want to do things that will cause shortages in Northern Ireland. But the other thing we want to do is to ensure that the Northern Ireland economy is plugged into the Great British economy rather than being separated from it. And that's more of a longer term worry, but we don't want to see supply chains change so that Northern Ireland becomes more dependent on the European Union than on the rest of the United Kingdom, because those economic links are of fundamental importance.
So it seems to me that your first port of call would be to roll forward the present extensions rather than invoke Article 16 formally.
Well, it's not my decision, but I think we want to do things in as good-natured a way as we can.
And so going on from there, I just want to imagine for a minute the government has to invoke 16, or indeed that it just extends. Either way, the European Union is going to bring legal action. This legal action will doubtless go speedily to the European Court. I'm a bit doubtful myself that the European Court would be an entirely fair arbiter. But I want to ask a quite different sort of question. If I were the government, what would be worrying me more wouldn't be the European Court. It'd be someone going to the domestic courts in the event of such action. So might it be the case that the government would have to pass legislation to ensure that the effects of the protocol were no longer felt under domestic law?
Well, that's a very important question. There's a very interesting case in front of the courts at the moment on whether the Act of Union is a constitutional statute or not. It'd be fascinating to see how that is decided and whether this concept of constitutional statutes has survived our departure from the European Union, whether such statutes have any purpose, and therefore what might need to be done under domestic law. But the UKIM bill showed that the UK government was willing to legislate to safeguard the United Kingdom and the interests of the United Kingdom, and legislation is always a tool that can be used.
Let's go on to COVID. As I'm very grateful to you for that the interesting answer and passage. I've really just got one line of thought about COVID. We'll know the government's announcement by tomorrow morning, but it's this, having thought about it a bit. I can see there's an argument for taking the remaining restrictions off. I can see there's an argument for keeping the present restrictions on. What's haunting me is this thought that if the present restrictions come off, either now, doesn't seem as though they're going to, let's imagine for they did, or at the end of next month, as they may, are we sure that enough people will be double vaccinated in the autumn not to have to put the restrictions back on, because the double vaccine gives you more protection than the single?
We've got to think about who is at risk, and if everybody in the top 9 categories has had the double vaccination and has had 2 weeks afterwards, people below those categories aren't at particular risk. It would seem to be odd to say that every 18-year-old should have a double vaccine before you can release the restrictions. Indeed, as people are becoming 18 every day, you would never end, would you? Because you wouldn't, depending on what you do with school children, but you would then be in the position of always waiting 6 weeks at least to take the restrictions off, so you'd never get there. So it can't be the case that everybody must be double vaccinated before you lift the restrictions. You need to look at the risk, and your article today was absolutely brilliant, I thought.
Is it all that bad?
No, it really interesting, and making a point that people haven't made. Infections are not what matters anymore. 2 things that matter: can the NHS cope and the number of deaths. Overwhelmingly most important is the number of deaths. People going into hospital for a couple of days and coming out again, it's not very important. They're dying, it's very important. We put on restrictions at the point at which we were facing 1,000 deaths a day, which we then got to, and those have stayed and been steadily reduced. If it's at 8 deaths a day, you're not going to be worrying about double vaccines so much. And this is just now, if there were to be a delay, a precautionary measure, I would have thought, rather than one saying, even at very low death rates, we must still ensure everybody is double vaccinated.
Well, it's a final prod at this, but what I was trying to get at today, I think, was this, that by end of July, all adults have had a single shot. Good. So the restrictions may well come off. But until we know how many have had a double shot by when, and we don't know, there must be the possibility that this version will spread. Fewer people will die, as you say, but that doesn't necessarily stop the hospitals being clogged up. If people are coming in and the hospitals are also trying to get back to normal and do their normal operations.
But ultimately, the NHS is there to serve the British people, not the British people there to serve the NHS. And therefore, we may need to spend more money on hospitals. But you can't run society purely to stop the hospitals being full. Otherwise, you'd never let us get in our cars and drive anywhere or do any of the other things that people want to do. So there has to be some proportionality within that. The government doesn't have the right to take charge of people's lives purely to prevent them seeing the doctor. Actually, we'd never be allowed in our kitchens, would we, where a disproportionate number of accidents in the home take place, or our bathrooms. So we become very hungry and very smelly on that basis.
Well, back to my hungry and smelly kitchen I must go, and you to your cleaner one. But it's been a fascinating Moggcast. I don't know how many we've got left until the summer recess, but I look forward to seeing you in a fortnight for the next one. So, Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Well, Paul, as always, thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.